And you've got so much of knowledge available now on chat prompts. What's your advice to everyone who's got young children now wondering about what should they be teaching their children so that when they grow up and when we don't know what the actual capabilities of these machines are, that what they've learned is still useful?
How old are your kids, Rahul?
So my son is 9 and my daughter is 5.
What are you telling them right now?
Now I want to learn from you, and I know we're telling them a lot of stuff, whether good, bad, ugly, I don't know. I'm trying to refine that and give them a framework of what we should be telling them.
So there's two things. So I think, first of all, this is probably one of the most common questions I get. By the way, it's really interesting that the tech experts, and there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about this 10 days ago, are basically telling their kids, don't learn computer science. That skill, at least basic computer programming, is gone. Advanced computer science, advanced data analysis, if you want to do that, that's going to be fine. What are they telling their kids to learn? They're telling their kids to learn how to teach dance. They're telling their kids to learn how to do plumbing. They're telling their kids to learn about the humanities. Why are they saying that? Implicitly, they're saying, what are those skill sets that are robust to machine intelligence? Now, I will say it is virtually impossible to predict that, given the pace at which this improvement is occurring. I probably have a slightly different kind of answer. By the way, my daughter's majoring in psychology without me telling her anything. So the kids, I think, know basically where this is going. But the one thing I'll say, Rahul, is I don't know, when you started out college, what were you majoring in?
Journalism.
Journalism. You started out with journalism. Okay, that's enlightened. I started out doing chemistry. And then the reason I switched to economics was probably like many of you. There was one teacher who inspired me. And that's what made me switch. And I would say to kids, follow the teachers who inspire you. And the reason is, if you can get inspired and passionate about a subject, that's going to build something that's going to be a skill that will last all your life, which is curiosity, which is intrinsic motivation. We talked about in the last session, this is no longer about learning episodically, it's about learning lifelong. And that's, I think, going to be the most important skill.
In the way that Indian families operate, and as do so many Asian families too, parents want to equip their children with the skills that are likely to be most useful when they grow up. So it used to be, say, engineering and doctors back in the day, then IT a few years ago. So if you were looking ahead, what do you think the children should be learning so that they acquire skills which are useful in the job market years down?
Yeah, I think that's honestly being too instrumental. As I said, 10 years ago, a lot of my students were talking to me and saying, what should I major in? I never told them computer science. If I told them that, I would have regretted it. But I genuinely mean this. That's looking at things too narrowly. What I would say is think about things like creativity, judgment, human emotion, empathy, psychology. Those are things that are going to be fundamentally important regardless of where computers are going. By the way, you can get those skills through various subjects. It doesn't matter. It's not a one-to-one mapping between those skills and a particular topic or disciplinary area. This is partly why I'm saying, really think about where their passion is.
How do we teach our children how to think? Because everything's available on Google, Copilot, ChatGPT, you can just ChatGPT it. So joining the dots, giving them a framework to be able to interpret, analyze, and think. How do you tell them that when the easiest thing is, isko Google kar lete hain?
Yeah. So it's a good question. Just two things on that. The first is, there was an interesting study done by colleagues at MIT recently, where they had groups of students, and they were asked to undertake a particular task or learn about a topic. Some students were given AI chatbots. Some students were only given Google search with no AI. What they found is the students with access to AI intelligence learned the material much faster. But when it came time to apply it on a separate test, which was different from the first one, they found it much harder. The students who learned the material through Google search with no other access took longer, but they did much better on those tests.
Why is that?
Part of the issue is learning is not simple. It takes effort, okay? And so part of the issue is you can't compress that effort. The harder it is to learn something, the more likely you'll remember it for longer periods of time. And so I think for me, the big implication is when I tell my students, look, all these technologies are available. It depends on how you use it. My basic approach to them is just saying, study. Because if you get domain expertise, you will be able to use these tools in a much more powerful way later on. So in some sense, this goes back to the notion of agency. It's like we can be lazy with tools and technologies, or we can be smart. It's all entirely up to you. But this is my advice.
You know, some of my friends in Silicon Valley have the toughest controls on their children when it comes to devices. You know, we look at how much time our children can spend on their iPads or TV. We're far more lenient. And they're the guys who are actually in the middle of the devices, and they're developing them, and they know the dangerous side effects. Now, those devices are also the repository of knowledge, which is where you can learn so much from. So as an educator, every parent has his own take on how much time children can spend. But as an educator, how do you look at this? Device addiction, just spending far more time, picking up some knowledge, but also wasting a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a nuance here, which is basically what they're doing is not saying don't use devices. They're saying don't use social media. And this goes back again to one of the things we were talking about earlier. We have gone through a decade where things like misinformation, disinformation, and so on, there is no good solution as far as we know today. There's also various other kinds of habits and so on that are getting accrued. That's partly what they're saying, stay away from. They're not saying stay away from computers. We can't do that. And in fact, you don't want to do that. But there's a nuance in terms of how we interact with tools and computers that we just want to keep in mind when we think about guardrails, right?
Are you seeing your students getting more and more obsessed with their devices, and how does that impact? And what are you trying to do to get them to socialize more? You know, to spend more time with each other and not be stuck on their phones or
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So in some sense, last year we had a conference at Harvard. We had 400 people from our community attend the conference. And some of our colleagues were saying, we should have a policy of laptops down. No laptops in class, take out your devices. I was coming in for a session right afterwards, but part of the reason I wanted them to take out their mobile phones was I had 2 or 3 polls during my lecture where I wanted them to give me their input. So I said, mobile phones out, okay? And this was sort of crazy. But the story illustrates something interesting, which is these devices for certain things can be really powerful. It can turn a passive learning modality into an active learning modality where every single person is participating. We don't want to take that away. What we want to try and deal with is people playing games while you're lecturing. Now, by the way, me personally, I just put it on myself. If I'm not exciting enough or energizing enough for my students to be engaged, use your mobile phones. That's on me, okay? But that's partly what
they're
the
quite
challenge
engaged. Show of hands, how many felt engaged during the session and how many were like, bhook lege, bhai, lunch kab ho raha hai? Achhe se bata do. Okay. So that which is why agentic AI and chatbots can never do what professors can, right? So I'll take some questions. Kali has a question. Kali, go ahead.